Welcome back to Empire Prints, guys. Today we are making a Commander Doom life-size bust. This was a very tedious print job, and I printed it all on PLA on a Bambu Lab P1S. And these files are from Galactic Armory's Clone Bust. This is scaled up, as you can see, about 650% to match the scale of my clone helmets, which I normally print at about 96% to fit my head. Could probably fit 100%, but I like a little slimmer fit to my helmet, so we printed this at about the same scale, and it's printed in 6 parts. I'm not doing a backside. This is purely for display, so I'm really only concerned with the front, and I wanted the shoulders in it. I thought it would look really cool. So we got a lot of sanding ahead of us, a lot of prep work to fill in these seam lines and make sure all these parts align. So let's get to it. Now, before we can start sanding, I like to glue and solder all these parts together. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take some Gorilla Glue, kind of spread it over the surface, and glue these parts together. And then to hold that glue in place while it's curing, I just put some tape and I take my soldering iron and I go along that entire seam line and just make sure they're really permanently attached. You want these pieces as aligned as you possibly can, because this is going to cause for a lot of sanding if you mess the alignment up. So just make sure you use some tape and take your time while doing this. Now moving on to the helmet, I'm just doing the same thing here, putting some frog tape in place, or really any tape, to hold my alignment in, and then I take my soldering iron and kind of just go along that inside seam. This is going to give it that nice solid connection. So for the first step of my sanding process, I'm taking a 220 grit sandpaper pad, and I'm just going over the whole print. This is going to get a majority of the lines out and make it so I can go straight into fillers and getting this thing smooth rather than dealing with all these annoying printer lines. So this is a great first initial step. I love doing this, and it saves me a lot of effort in the long run. So for these undersuit portions of the bust, I just took some 220 grit and I hand sanded them. The mouse sander couldn't really reach them that well, so I just went in, did some hand sanding. It's unavoidable in projects like these, but that's okay. And then we're going to move on to our Bondo acetone mixture, and we're going to wipe this over the entire print, really getting those nooks and crannies. And make sure you're wearing proper PPE. This stuff is toxic, especially when working with acetone. You want to use gloves. You do not want it on your skin. And then once this Bondo layer has kind of dried after about 5 to 10 minutes, I normally give it about 5 minutes, I take some solid Bondo without the acetone and I go over all those seam lines. I did not put the Bondo acetone on the shoulders as they were already very smooth, and I just didn't think it was necessary, and I was kind of testing some things out on my sanding process for this print. While the Bondo was drying on the bust, I moved on to the helmet, and I'm going to take some 220 grit sandpaper, and same thing here, I'm just going to go over the entire helmet. I did not decide to do the Bondo acetone mixture. I normally do this on my helmets, but I wanted to see, is it possible to do it without and get it nice and smooth? I regret that very much so. That was a bad idea. The Bondo acetone has worked for me so well on all my prints, and Bambu does a great job at giving those very nice quality prints, but Bondo is just still so nice for getting that initial filler layer in and makes my sanding process a heck of a lot easier, so I would not do this in the future for my helmets. Now, before we put on some filler primer, I just like to come in with some 400 grit wet sand, and I like to sand down smooth that initial Bondo layer as well as those seam lines, and this is going to give it a nice smooth base for our filler primer. And then for filler primer, I'm just using some Rust-Oleum filler primer. I do not like the 2-in-1 filler. The filler primer just tends to sand a little bit easier and doesn't clog up my sandpaper as much, so I recommend just the filler primer and not the 2-in-1 sander. This stuff just works great. After I had primed both pieces, I went on to some Bondo to fill in all the seam lines, specifically on the helmet. I don't think I properly aligned the dome and had it sit all the way flush on the helmet, so it left this massive seam line along the front and a little bit on the back, which was very frustrating, but I knew just taking my time with some Bondo and building it up, I'll be able to fill that line in without any issues. And then here on the dome, I'm just filling in those deeper layer line imperfections, which you normally get when you print a dome. After the Bondo and filler has dried, I come in with some 400 grit sandpaper and I wet sand both parts, getting them nice and smooth and prepped for a base coat of white. And you just want to rinse and repeat this process as many times as necessary. Put Bondo in areas it needs to be, or more filler if there's still some layer lines showing. It's a very tedious process, but I assure you, the more time you put into this, the better quality piece you're going to have. After wet sanding both parts, I can move on to some Rust-Oleum Ultra Matte white paint, and this is my base coat for Commander Doom to give it a nice layer to weather the green paint through. So when I do scratches and scuffs, that white layer that is on all clones is going to show through, give that really nice textured, detailed weathering. Commander Doom has two very unique pauldrons, and before we can start on the left pauldron, we need that green base layer. So for this pauldron, there's a little bit of a white stripe and then a little bit of a white portion. So I'm just taping that off and getting it prepped for the green paint. For the green paint, I used Sap Green by Dollar Rally, and this is an acrylic ink. I put it through my airbrush. You don't have to thin it down at all. It sprays out great. You just have to do multiple layers. You are going to have to do 7 or 8 layers to get that nice flat look. You can use spray paint for this if you don't have an airbrush. They do make greens out there very similar in color to what I used, or if you wanted a brighter green. I was shooting for a very dark end of the Clone Wars look, like dark times are coming, the colors kind of fading out of their armor at the end of the war with scratches and scuffs. And another reason I use airbrush paints is it's really thin compared to spray paint, so it's really easy to scratch up with sandpaper or an X-Acto blade or anything like that. So that's the reason I use an airbrush, but you can use spray paint if you need to. While the bust was drying, I went on to Commander Doom's helmet, which is just taping up the cheeks and face portion of his helmet. And this is definitely one of the easier tape jobs I've had in a long time. It was so nice to do this in like 5 minutes. And all I'm doing is using some yellow frog tape, which is meant for delicate surfaces. This stuff is great for getting those clean, crisp lines, and you don't have to risk it about pulling up your paint on you as long as you're gentle. And then I did about 7 to 8 layers of that sap green paint, and just make sure to be very consistent in your layers. You don't want white paint poking through on you. Now, Commander Doom has some yellow markings throughout his armor, specifically on his left shoulder, and then he has this yellow triangle on the right side of his chest, as well as on his command visor. And I'm just using the same yellow I used for my Commander Bly helmet, which is Liquitex Yellow Oxide. This stuff is already ready to be put in an airbrush. I love this stuff, and it lays down super flat and easy. And then we can move on to painting the details. For the detail portions of the undersuit, I'm just taking some matte black paint and I'm just hand brushing this. This is the easiest and quickest method. I would recommend taping up areas if you don't have a steady hand. I fortunately just kind of wing it with my steady hand, and I paint up all these undersuit areas. If I do get any leakage or I paint somewhere I don't want to paint, it's okay. We'll cover it up in weathering. Otherwise, you can take your X-Acto blade and scrape up the paint. This stuff is very thin. It will scrape up just fine very easily. If you guys were wondering, I did sand the back. I could not leave it unsanded. It would have bothered me, and I would know it's there when it's on display. So I just come in with some matte black paint and paint over the back of it just to give it that clean finish look on the back. After it was all painted, it's ready for the first step of my weathering process, which is to take an X-Acto blade and some 400 grit sandpaper and just scuff up the entirety of the armor. I like to come in with some 400 grit sandpaper. It's a new process for me, but it works great for that very detailed, textured look. I mean, you can feel the scratch. It's really cool, and I love this technique. And then I use the X-Acto blade for some more detailed scratches, for a little more control. Before I move any further in my weathering process, I wanted to catch the helmet up to the bust in weathering, so I wanted to first paint the detail portions. I wanted to paint the brow line, the gray strip that goes along the back, and the frown portion. I hand paint these. I just think it's very fast and efficient, and if you tape up the area, you should have no problem with leakage. Now, unfortunately, because I do not have a resin printer, I have to hand sand all these detail pieces, the aerators, the antenna, the flashlight that Commander Doom has. It is a very tedious process, but if you're like me and don't have a resin printer, you can hand sand these. I just use some 220 grit sandpaper, and they sand perfectly smooth. If you need some Bondo or some filler, add it, but for the most part, I'm able to just 220 grit sand these, and it gets all the layer lines out without a problem. The last detail portions we have to paint are these lines. They are very tedious to hand paint, but if you're weathering your helmet, you'll cover them up without a problem. Just take your time with these, and there is a stencil from Galactic Armory if you would like to airbrush them on. It works great. I just prefer to hand paint them as it's much faster. And then I'm going to do the same thing with the helmet as I did for the bust. I'm going to take some 400 grit sandpaper, hit all the high points, the edges, and scrape up some either blaster marks or some bigger scuffs. And then I'm going to come in with my X-Acto blade and get a more refined, some detail scratches so I can have a little bit more control on where I want them. For the aerators and flashlight as well as the antenna, I just come in with some flat black and I paint all those pieces over. This is going to give it a nice base for weathering because I'm going to add rust to all these pieces. And then I use some flat gray paint for the earpieces. For the weather wash I like to do on all my helmets and props, I take some black acrylic paint diluted with a lot of water, and then I like to scrub this over the entire helmet and dab it off with a paper towel. Make sure you do not wipe because it will look like streaks and it will look less realistic, so make sure you are dabbing it off in a very uncontrolled manner, very unevenly. After weather washing both pieces of the helmet and bust, I realized I still had to do some detail painting, specifically on the visor. All commanders have these white stripes on the visor, so I just taped these off and I hand painted them. Once the visor had been painted, I wanted to glue on some of the details for ease of weathering, and then I can move on to my favorite part of the weathering process, which is using pastel chalks with some Mod Podge diluted with some water. All you want to do is you want to get this in all the crevices, around the ears, in the cheeks, on the back of the helmet, anywhere you think dirt might be built up. And I love using chalk because it gives this nice textured dirt look. Like you can feel the grains of the chalk. You just want to grind it up with your X-Acto blade and put some Mod Podge, mix it in, and it gives you that like this watery textured paint. It's really cool. I found this technique over from Bruncher Builds. Go check him out. His stuff is great. But this is my favorite way to weather a helmet. This stuff is so good, and you can get a really dirty helmet, depending on the look you're going for. The look I always shoot for is a very dirty, weathered look. I like to tell a story with all my helmets. I like to show they've been worn in. They've been through dozens of battles, which they have. These guys have been fighting for years. Their helmets are not going to be clean, especially when you're bouncing around planet to planet or if you're fighting on a ship. So make it as dirty as you want. This is all up to you. After adding brown dirt in all the crevices and around the ears, I like to come in with a rust chalk, which is this orangish brown chalk, and I like to go around all the areas that there's been rust buildup. Some of it's just me being creative, and other is inspiration from Revenge of the Sith, where you have the rust buildup around the ears, and then I like to add rust around the aerators, as well as the antenna, and maybe a little bit on the visor. This is just such a cool look, and it really shows it's been worn in by this point. And then I come in with some black chalk, and I add some scorch marks. It's a little hard to see on the green, but you can still see it, so I like to still go in and add that little bit of extra detail. And I'm really happy with how this turned out. After I finish weathering on the helmet, I do pretty much the same thing for the bust. I take some brown chalk and I go in all the crevices and kind of have a built up dirt look. And then I take some black chalk and I add some black scorch marks and some other forms of weathering throughout the piece. So off camera, I sanded and painted the Commander rank badge, which I almost totally forgot that Commander Doom had. But looking at reference photos, I saw he had a red, blue, black, and light blue marking from what I could see, and this is when it really started to come to life. I was really happy how this turned out. After that, it was just putting in the Hobart face shield, which I use on all my helmets, and then some chicken wire mesh for the back of the frown. And then we just needed to add the antenna on the back of the helmet, and this helmet and bust were all ready to be shown off. If you've made it this far in the video, thanks so much for watching. I had a lot of fun making this project, and I look forward to making more projects like this in the future. Subscribe for more. I'll see you in the next one.